Hello, everyone, and welcome. I am Geisha Gonzalez, and I'm the Senior Vice President at the Center for European Policy Analysis, or CEPA. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's discussion on Europe's energy security. As Kremlin aggression in Europe continues to escalate, this is undoubtedly one of the critical issues facing the alliance. Before I hand it over to our distinguished panel, I'd like to say a quick word of thanks to the US Embassy in Bratislava for their kind support of this event series. And I'd also like to encourage all of you to follow along CEPA's analysis of these issues by following us on Twitter, LinkedIn, or by going to cepa.org. Now, without further ado, please allow me to introduce today's moderator, Dr. Ora Sabadus, Senior Energy Journalist for the Independent Commodity Intelligence Services. Ora, over to you.
Thank you very much, Geisha. Hello, everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this webinar. It is a pleasure to be chairing this discussion with excellent speakers. And before I give the floor to our speakers, I would like to start with a few very brief remarks on the topic that we've chosen for this particular subject, namely countering malign influence through energy investments. Last year's unprecedentedly high and volatile prices across European gas markets and claims that Russia's refusal to export more volumes as a means to coerce EU authorities into approving the controversial Nord Stream 2 pipeline have been raising questions about Europe's dependence on what many perceived as a rogue player. Since the start of the year, those questions took on even more alarming turn when the threat of a new Russian military attack against Ukraine raised the prospect of widespread supply curtailments caused either by damaged infrastructure potentially caught up in the crossfire or as a deliberate Russian response to possible Western sanctions. With a de-escalation in sight, possibly, after a flurry of Western diplomatic negotiations, Europe's risk premium may dissipate for now. But as some traders were telling me in conversations this week, the reality is that Europe will remain vulnerable to ongoing geopolitical risk in the long term. The last few months have shown us what dependence on Russia actually means. But let us not forget that the recent experience is only a facet of the multiple and often under the radar risks that Europe and its allies are facing from Russia, and increasingly so from China. Cyber attacks against critical infrastructure, such as those seen against a string of oil depots in Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands in recent days, or against the Colonial Pipeline last year in the US, intellectual property theft or stealthy acquisitions of companies are part and parcel of a hybrid war, which is only likely to intensify in the years to come. But how did we actually get here? And what are options, particularly at a moment in time when technology is becoming increasingly more sophisticated and the energy industry itself is in flux, requiring radical change? At an ideological level, if bolstering our defenses means battening down the hatches and giving states greater powers in pushing back against Chinese or Russian influence, what implications will this have for Europe and Western allies, particularly with regards to our cherished liberal free trade model? These are very complex questions, and although we cannot even remotely hope to fathom their depths in 1 hour, the speakers with me today and I hope that we will at least encourage further debate on this topic. So I would like to invite each panelist to make some very short introductory remarks. And I would like to begin with Dr. Agnia Grigas, non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council Eurasia Center, to give us her thoughts on this subject. Thank you, Agnia.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here. So I'd like to highlight 3 factors here in these opening remarks. So why do we think of Europe as so vulnerable in the energy sector? Well, first of all, the European Union today, it's the largest consumer and importer of energy in the world. Its own domestic production is rather limited and it's on the decline. So while the European Union has a real large plan for renewables, until that fully comes to fruition, The European Union bloc will remain dependent on imports of fossil fuels from not so friendly states. And here the case is really a historical dependency, particularly on Russian gas imports that have been in place since really the Cold War era, since as early as the 70s, the 60s, the 80s for some states. So that's the first factor, really, kind of this immediate dependency that the European Union can't escape immediately. Now, the second element in question is the fact that when we consider Russian and Chinese investment projects, in the commercial space, in the energy space, we have to keep in mind that these are very, very different types of investors and companies than those that would be within the European Union or the United States. So these are not private, commercial, or multinational corporations. These are state-owned companies that are pursuing not just commercial aims, but actually largely geopolitical and political aims. So we think of companies like Gazprom. This is not just a multinational energy company. This is a company that is run under the very close watch of the Kremlin, and a lot of the policies it pursues have geostrategic aims. And here, when we look, we can also see that China, I think, has over the years taken up a lot of Russia's playbook. So when it seeks to create certain infrastructure projects, they are also not simply for the purposes of commercial aims or profit, but rather means of trying to exert greater geopolitical influence in particular regions. And when we see even some specific tactics, for example, like Gazprom used to let companies run up their gas debts. So then these countries would be forced to sell off their gas infrastructure. So we've seen also China engage in these types of aggressive lending tactics. And the third factor I'd like to mention in my opening remarks is the 3 Seas initiative. So it's essentially a project linking 12 countries in Europe, the countries that border the Baltic Sea, the Adriatic Sea, and the Black Sea, and their aims in terms of strengthening the regional infrastructure, both when it comes to renewable projects and renewable energy sharing, and also gas interconnections. So I think this 3 Seas initiative is an effort on the part of these states in the European Union to counter both the Russian and Chinese efforts in terms of the energy sector and these types of geopolitically tinged infrastructure projects. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Agnia. That was a very good introduction. Our second speaker is Dr. Emily Holland, Assistant Professor at the Russia Maritime Studies Institute, United States Naval War College. If you could give us your introductory remarks, Emily, please.
Sure. Well, I think Agnia really teed us off well with a really great overview of the sort of challenges, but also sort of different infrastructure and geopolitical aims that serve to make this a very, very complicated picture. And I think your introduction was really apt because it sort of mirrors what everybody is paying attention to at this moment, which is that Europe has this crisis of energy security. But for those of us certainly on this panel who have been watching this issue for many years, we know this is not a new issue. Right. This has been at the forefront of sort of European policy for many years, particularly after 2006 and 2009, when there were the Ukrainian gas crises that resulted in interruption of gas supplies between Russia and Europe. But, I think overall, it's actually more of a mixed picture, right? So right now is this moment of crisis. So we see that actually, yes, there are some very serious issues to be worried about. But, the EU actually has made quite significant improvements to its energy security over the last decade. And I think that part of the story is not really being recognized as much as it should be. Europe has pursued a policy of diversification. It has sought to increase multiple sources of supply, to have what we call infrastructure redundancy, right? So not to be reliant on one particular pipeline for everything, and just improving sort of interconnectedness across the continent. Sort of prior to 2006 and 2009, there were areas of Europe that we called gas islands, right? That were not connected to the rest of Europe with gas infrastructure. And Europe has really actually made significant inroads into each of these areas, not to mention that LNG import capacity has grown, I think, over threefold since 2005 in Europe. So there's been a lot of changes. And that actually has brought us to a point where if the worst happened and there were to be a complete disruption of Russian gas supplies this season, Europe could survive, right? So these kind of changes have actually made it possible for Russia to be more resilient in terms of its energy infrastructure. So that's the good news. The bad news is that there is still an incredible level of dependency on Russian supplies. And it is probably likely that if there were a longer term disruption to Russian gas supplies, complete, like let's say in the 5-year period, that would be pretty devastating to European energy, right? And it sort of leads us to this point. There is just a profound lack of sort of medium-term energy and gas security strategy up to the point of 2050. At 2050, the goal is very clear, right? Reducing hydrocarbons and reducing energy dependence in Europe, right? But there's not really been a very clear, agreed upon pathway on how to achieve this. Because while we talk about the EU and we talk about EU as an energy bloc, the EU is comprised of individual states with completely different energy needs, energy resources, and energy interests. And so we've seen over the past decade, and more like 2 decades, the sort of inability of Europe to act as a bloc collectively on the challenge of energy security. What this crisis might give us, and I think we've seen this beginning to happen, is that maybe this is the impetus that Europe needs to act together to finally, act as one bloc collectively to meet the very serious energy security challenges it is facing in the future.
Those are really good points. I'm sure we will be discussing them during the actual debate a little later on. But we also have Dr. Andrej Nosko, a researcher at Matej University, Banska, Bystrica. If you could please give us your introductory remarks.
Thank you so much for inviting me to this timely debate. It's on one hand, it's very good that we're continuing this conversation. On the other hand, it's saddening that I just looked into my calendar, and about a year ago, we were discussing similarly, mainly around the Nord Stream 2, which was right before being finished. And I think we were still being hopeful that won't happen, and it still happened. As a visiting researcher at the Matej University, I work on the EU Green Recovery project, which specifically looks at the problems of the green transition in Europe. And during this conversation, I would like to maybe highlight 2 points. The one is the tension that we see between the EU's regulatory power and the geopolitical reality. To maybe summarize it is some people in EU believe that Russian tanks cannot enter the EU because they don't comply with the EU's emission standards. And, with maybe a little bit with the tongue in the cheek, this really illustrates the perception of some of us in the European Union, believing that the rules-based society that we have and the regulatory power of the EU can actually withhold and provide the protection in the world that is inhabited also by actors that are running on the geopolitical logic. And we really see it in the ongoing energy situation that we have. We can call it an energy crisis, where it goes into the second point that I would like to discuss, and that's the ongoing energy and industrial transition that Europe is setting on, and how we see that the hybrid warfare is being employed to potentially sabotage and torpedo the efforts for the policy transition in Europe. And I can elaborate on that a little bit more. Maybe just going back to also what Emily said, we have seen a lot of diversification in Europe since 2009. There was a really focus on kind of N-1 scenarios. So what happens if one of the infrastructures into the country is completely taken out of the picture? Can the country still withstand? But unfortunately, this diversification has been very unidimensional. It has really focused mostly on the infrastructure. It hasn't done any significant progress in terms of diversification of suppliers or diversification of contracts, and not speaking about diversification of fuels. If we don't see, in some countries moving away from nuclear towards natural gas, which further exacerbated the geopolitical element of European dependency. And in terms of the energy and industrial transition, what we see right now is that on one hand, the increasing energy prices that, in my view, and I have written about it, are into a large extent due to the behavior, to an unusual behavior of Russia as a supplier of gas and its energy companies, when they behaved very differently from how they behaved in the previous years. At the same time, they have also behaved very differently to other market players. They are also, and that goes back to my point about tension between the EU's regulatory power and the liberal trade model. Russia is the only external gas supplier that also controls natural gas storage in Europe. And it has conveniently used it in a way that we are not in a position to say that the Russians' behavior is motivated to speed up the regulatory approval of their Nord Stream 2 pipeline. But in case it would have been, they would have behaved exactly the same way. So it looks like we cannot say that they are trying to pressure a German regulator to speed up the processing, but if they were actually trying to do that, they would probably behave in a very similar way. The other thing is that also the energy price crisis that we see currently, it is very conveniently, if you see at the media that is taking a lot of sources from Russia-controlled media networks, you see that there are elements of trying to present the current situation as the outcome of European Union's attempts to green up and decarbonize its economy. So you could also see this as an active effort to undermine Europe's transition to green economy, because that could potentially harm major fossil fuel suppliers. So obviously the question for us in Europe, obviously, is how can we provide Europe with a reliable, stable transition energy sources before the European Union is able to switch to carbon neutral economy and energy systems, without actually undermining and losing the popular support for this energy transition. And there the question is, maybe it's the time to rethink the liberal trade model, especially if we are facing actors that are not behaving in a ways that normal market players would be expected to. I'm happy to elaborate a little bit more later on as well.
There is a lot of scope to elaborate on that, I'm sure it is. And last but not least, I'm delighted to invite Dr. Benjamin Schmitt, Senior Fellow Democratic Resilience Center for European Policy Analysis, to give his final, his introductory remarks before we open the floor to discussion.
Thanks so much, and it's so great to see everyone, so many good friends on this panel. I will start by, I guess, pushing back a little bit on what Andrej said. The Russian Federation under President Vladimir Putin has had a long and sordid history of using energy as a political weapon against the transatlantic community, particularly Ukraine and NATO's eastern flank. And the Kremlin's actions over the past several months, where they have explicitly linked an increase in gas supply deliveries to EU storages in exchange for rapid certification of Moscow-backed Nord Stream 2, is a direct example of using energy as a weapon. Now, setting the stage a little bit, the current gas crisis across the EU was not solely initiated by the Kremlin and its energy market actions that we've seen. Key crisis contributors included a colder than normal spring, a calmer than normal summer, leading to a drop in electricity production from EU wind turbines, and an unanticipated jump in global demand, especially from Chinese consumers, driven by a faster than expected market recovery post COVID-19. So there was already kind of this perfect storm of global trends taking place that would conspire against the European energy market. But over the past several months, the Kremlin's Gazprom has taken steps that have actively tightened that market further, declining to follow through on its expected annual practices of sending additional gas flows along existing routes, including the Belarus, Poland, Germany, Yamal pipeline, which, at any given moment we're seeing either is delivering gas or operating in reverse flow, so it's not delivering any gas, and really having strange activities this year. Or the Ukrainian gas transmission system, where ample spare capacity has existed to bring above normal, above contracted volumes to Gazprom's own storage facilities in Europe ahead of the onset of winter. And we don't have to just imagine what the motivations are, because Kremlin officials and other Russian officials have made it clear. For example, Konstantin Koshifov, a representative of Russia's Federation Council, expressed a not even remotely veiled disdain for the EU's energy diversification policies, saying, quote, "We cannot ride to the rescue just to compensate for mistakes that we didn't commit." And then he went on by saying that he seemingly linked further Russian gas exports to alleviate the crisis with, quote, "mutually beneficial agreements." Shortly thereafter, this is at the end of last year, Kremlin's envoy to the EU, Vladimir Chisov, linked an increase in Russian gas exports to Europe with a change in Brussels' policy of approach generally towards Moscow, where he warned EU officials, quote, "to change adversary to partner, and things get resolved easier. When the EU finds enough political will to do this, they will know where to find us." And last but not least, back in October, we of course heard Russian President Vladimir Putin linking Gazprom's future decisions to a rapid German certification of Nord Stream 2, declaring that, quote, if the German regulator hands its clearance for supplies tomorrow, supplies of 17.5 billion cubic meters per year of natural gas will start the day after tomorrow. And of course, last but not least, we've seen headlines that have come out a number of times where Gazprom has offered Moldova new gas deals only in exchange for weaker EU regulatory ties. So all of those are elements of energy weaponization. And we have to remember, back in July 2021, there was a joint statement between the United States and Germany where both governments agreed to, quote, "should Russia attempt to use energy as a weapon or commit further aggressive acts against Ukraine, Germany will take action at the national level and press for effective measures at the European level, including sanctions to limit Russian export capabilities to Europe in the energy sector, including gas, or in other economically relevant sectors." And we have not seen that take place. There has been a very clear threshold that has been met, and many experts, I would love to hear what others on this panel think. Is Russia weaponizing energy? Has it weaponized energy in the past several months? But I know that a lot of the community thinks that that is the case. And this is why we need to be concerned today, because when we're talking about infrastructure investments from authoritarian nations in general, it's not just about this kind of market analysis approach, what I call the Bloomberg terminal approach. It's really important to look at the global price dynamics and in regional supply numbers and things like this. But you also have to link this to how authoritarian nations like Russia and China have a multidisciplinary approach to using, in the case of Russia, energy infrastructure investments, in the case of China, critical infrastructure investments, telecoms investments, and things like this, to affect trends like elite capture and strategic corruption, and to basically put hybrid pressure on democratic norms abroad. The fact that Russia can even come out and pressure publicly a German independent regulator should give pause, because if there's not a significant pushback, and I still haven't seen the level of pushback that identifies this problem from Berlin as it should be, I think we basically see that the authoritarian nation strategies begin to work, where it reduces the democratic resilience and confidence in the independence of these organizations that are needed for regulating market liberalization. So that's a lot of things. We can talk more about this as we go on, but thank you so much, and this is a great time to have this panel, certainly.
Actually, while you're here, and obviously Nord Stream 2 is the hot topic of the day, lots of people are talking about cancelling it, especially in case Russia attacks Ukraine again. But let's assume Nord Stream 2 is indeed cancelled, and the European Union will take, as well as the US, will take a number of sanctions against Russia. How do you see Europe's dependence on Russia going forward? I mean, obviously, Western Europe does have a lot of choice, as Emily just said, but we're still talking here Eastern Europe, the countries that are further inland that don't have immediate access to LNG, and where there is some kind of interconnection, but maybe blocked either because of politics or because of regulatory issues. So how do you see that? I mean, what could the EU do in the very short term in order to limit Gazprom's hold on Europe?
Those are great questions. I think I have a couple of answers for that. Number one, we need to remember what Nord Stream 2 is. It's not a project that is aimed to bring significant new gas volumes to Germany and points west. It's often been reported in the past few weeks as this has gotten kind of into the broader media discussion that this is a project that Germany needs because of any number of reasons. The problem with that is it posits that Nord Stream is actually bringing significant new gas volumes to Germany, and that's not the case. What it's doing, it's rerouting existing flows that are going through the Ukrainian gas transmission system, bringing them from Ust-Lunga in the near St. Petersburg in the Russian Federation through the Baltic Sea to the Lubin gas hub in Germany. But from there, only 9.9 billion cubic meters of that gas has the technical capability, according to the Eugal pipeline, the onshore portion of Nord Stream 2, its technical specifications, to bring only 9.9 of that 55 billion cubic meters per year to Germany and points west. The rest goes to the Baumgarten gas hub in Austria. And that's important because that's the end point of the current Ukrainian gas transmission network. And so we see a lot of discussion of, well, Ukraine would lose, $1 billion or more per year in transit revenues that it gets, operating the Ukrainian GTS. That's a problem because, obviously it would harm Ukraine's economic health at a time that Russia is trying to destabilize Ukraine, obviously by military force, or at least the threat of military force. But we also have to think of it in terms of strategic deterrence, because Russia currently relies still, even today, on those pipelines to get its own resource to market and make revenues for the Russian Federation by going from Russia through Ukraine and onward to the Baumgarten gas hub in Austria, which is the end point of that route, right? The pipelines that are, the physical infrastructure, forget about the resource itself, the physical infrastructure that Russia still relies on sits in close physical proximity to the Donbass, to the line of contact. There's parts of the pipeline network that basically circumscribe the current line of contact, the military fighting. So this is why Ukraine views the Ukrainian gas transmission system is not only an energy project, but also a strategic balance project, strategic reliance project to deter Russian aggression, with the assumption that Russia does not want to destabilize its own revenue sources. So that's number one. Number two is that since 2015, when the European Union put forth its European Energy Union concept to bring about what I call the hardware and software policies of European diversification strategy, the hardware being diversification infrastructure, the software being market liberalization, updates to the gas directive and things like this, support for market liberalization policies like the third energy package. We've seen some Western European nations, in particular Germany and Austria, decide to go in the other direction and build a strategic dependence on Russian infrastructure, in this case, with projects like Nord Stream 2. Even if they're not the main recipients of the gas to begin with, the infrastructure dependence is still there. So this is something that needs to get in line. I think we may be, from some of the statements that we've seen recently, getting to this inflection point where these countries may also start to realize what the Eastern European nations have for many years, that diversification is really important. And then finally, I'll just say that yesterday, in the joint press conference with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, when asked about the nomination of former German Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder to the Gazprom board, Russian President Vladimir Putin, of course, said that Nord Stream 2 is just a commercial deal, but also decided to go on and point out that German consumers should be happy that Schroeder is on the board because they can then pay several % less for their gas, immediately undermining this farcical notion this is just a commercial deal. So, I mean, we could talk absolutely more about this and how authoritarian nations weaponize and conduct strategic corruption and have this Schroederization effect for former officials. But that's kind of where I'll leave it in terms of where things stand right now.
Thank you. I'll pick up from here, from where you just mentioned that we don't have a single unitary voice in Europe, and right now it's a critical moment, of course, to come in with a package of probably new measures to secure Europe's energy supplies. But I'll go back to Agnia, because she also talked about Nord Stream and also Russia and Gazprom's influence in Europe, and she mentioned the 2006-2009 supply curtailments, and obviously after 2009, as we know, the European Commission came up with the third energy package, and many of the measures that were taken could arguably be said were taken in response to what happened. So having this crisis in mind, the one that we just experienced last year, what sort of measures do you expect to see going forward from the European Union? And do you think that there will be, let's say, a consensus? Can we expect at all a consensus, at least as far as gas as a transition fuel? We know that there are plans to phase it out. Has this changed the picture at all?
So I think that from what we've seen, a consensus will be very difficult to reach. Because again, the different European Union countries are coming from very different positions. And I wanted to come back a little bit to, this earlier comment. I think there's this general idea now that the, Central or Eastern European countries are more vulnerable than, let's say, some of the Western countries. But I think by this point, that has not become necessarily the case. If we look, and for example, the case of Germany in particular, I'm probably more concerned today about the case of Germany than I am about the case of Poland or Lithuania or so on. So countries that historically were dependent, where Gazprom had a monopoly market, again, the Poland, the Baltic states, so on, they've taken real concrete measures. So Poland today has an LNG import terminal, Lithuania has an LNG import terminal. Finland has built up several terminals with plans for more. Croatia has plans for a terminal. When we look at Germany, for example, so Germany is the largest gas importing state within Europe. It is Gazprom's largest market in Europe. And yet this is a country that doesn't have an LNG import terminal. Even most recently, there were some discussions for LNG import terminal. And then there were comments from the German energy companies saying like, well, in the present day market conditions, there's just not investor appetite for an LNG import terminal. I mean, it's extraordinary. And that is partly because, Gazprom has worked very hard to try to lock in the German market. With Nord Stream 1, Nord Stream 2, of course, Schroederization, vested interest groups, political influence, and so on. So I think going forward, it may be that the more vulnerable countries will actually take further steps and we'll see more unity on their front. But the countries, while Germany may appear today quite vulnerable from my perspective in their gas markets, because again, they've also shut down their nuclear power. They haven't made it all the way to their green and renewable transition. So right now they'll be increasingly dependent on Russian gas. But some countries will, and then nonetheless, such as Germany, will perceive maybe their greater economic power as a sort of potential leverage or potential safety guard, or again, maybe as Ben mentioned, or no, I think it was Andrej mentioned this belief that our rule-based society or rules can somehow, protect the European Union from outside authoritarian actors.
Thank you. We'll come back to Russia, but I would also like to talk a little about China's influence in the energy sector. And I have a question for Emily, because she mentioned the diversification, not just of resource, not just of routes, but also of fuels, right? And I've dug out a couple of interesting figures. So apparently, overall Chinese investments in Europe over the last 2 decades amount to roughly 180 billion euros. And interestingly, in 2019, we had foreign direct investments of about 12 billion euros, which was a 69% drop on 2016, when FDIs were roughly 37 billion euros. Now, this in itself indicates a big U-turn, and I would like to understand what has been triggering this U-turn, the perception of China, and also if the Chinese are not or kept at arm's length, as we've seen, for example, in the UK, where I am right now. We haven't seen private investors coming in. I'm talking here particularly about the nuclear sector, where the UK had plans to build a couple of nuclear reactors. China may not be taking a front position, but neither are private sector investors. So Emily, how can we diversify? How can we diversify fuels if we actually do not have interested parties? And how do you see this, particularly in the light of nuclear and gas receiving special status under the green taxonomy?
Sure, that's a great question. So, the issue of Chinese economic statecraft has garnered significant attention for many years, right? And so those of us who study Russia's economic statecraft have for years been saying, hey, Russia is doing some very interesting things too that we should also be paying attention to, most notably in the energy sector. But China, throughout the past decade has, as you said, has increased FDI, has made, really concerted infrastructure efforts in certain European states. I'm thinking notably about Serbia, right? Huge, infrastructure projects, projects in 5G and facial recognition technology, sort of all of these different things to increase their presence and their influence in these states. And I was working on an Ipsos project in Serbia a few years ago, and we did a wide-ranging country survey where we asked Serbians, who do you think is the biggest investor in your country? And almost 60% said the Chinese, which is completely false, because the biggest investor in Serbia by an enormous margin is, of course, the European Union. Right. So there's these perceptions of Chinese investment that I think are very scary to Europeans, and that might have sort of triggered a little bit of a U-turn in the ability of China to sort of get the political gains that it wanted to out of those economic statecraft issues. Now, on the nuclear issue, this is super interesting. We've seen over the past decade, more now, Russia really dominating the market of constructing nuclear power plants. They control like almost 70% of the global market for reactors. And this is for a number of reasons. But as you say, I think one of the most important reasons has been the retreat of Western firms from the market. So, after Fukushima, there became such a disinterest in nuclear power from the Western European perspective. This is what triggered Germany's decision to shut down its nuclear reactors. And so Western firms started to sort of lose state backing, lose markets, and they were not able to compete with Russia's state-owned atomic corporation, Rosatom, because Rosatom is state-owned, right? It's a state-controlled organization. They offer subsidies to their consumers. So they're winning all of these tenders because they're basically financing the construction of nuclear power plants and then, receiving financing back through the sales of long-term electricity. Another sort of issue that has stymied the ability of Western firms to participate in tenders for nuclear power plants in particular are tender requirements for nuclear fuel spent fuel take back, right? So, for example, Turkey put out a tender, I guess now probably 15 years ago, for its Akuyu nuclear power plant. And one of the main points that they had in that tender was the requirement for states to take spent nuclear fuel back. And so, although there were a number of tenders from firms, actually Rosatom was the only one that met that requirement because they were willing to take back that spent nuclear fuel. So there are sort of issues with the Western nuclear firms that are preventing it from competing with Russian and then increasingly Chinese nuclear firms, right? Because China is sort of trying to get into this game as well. So, sort of beyond Europe, looking at like the greater world, we're seeing these Western firms start to fall behind even further because of these two main issues. And I think now, certainly that, the idea of nuclear in Europe has been brought back a little bit more to the table, given this current gas crisis. We might see more discussion in Europe about, maybe kind of loosening regulations, or perhaps some discussions on how best to support Western firms, because there are a bunch of Western firms sort of still out there and active in building and producing nuclear power.
That's a great point. And obviously, let's not forget that in a couple of countries, I'm talking Romania, for example, when Exxon pulled out and the stake in the Neptune block was up for sale, one of the conditions that was imposed by the government was that the stake would be bought by Western companies. So from the start, it actually excluded Lukoil, which was interested. But I would like to talk to Andrej about Eastern European countries. We obviously had the 17+1, and I think it's now 16+1 format after, I believe, Lithuania pulled out following the Taiwan spat. And also to talk about, since Emily mentioned Serbia, to talk about the countries that are on the fringe of the European Union, but which have seen quite a considerable Chinese investment. What's the perception, first of all, in Eastern Europe, which have actually attracted and have been quite, excited about Chinese investment in recent years? And what's the situation now? And what's the situation on the fringe of the European Union, particularly with countries that may get disillusioned because they're not invited to join the EU? Well, is China an option?
Excellent question. Really great. On one hand, we sometimes see simplification of division between the Western and Eastern members within the European Union, as if they were a one bloc. But the similar differences that we see between the Western and Eastern part of the EU, we see also within them. And there it comes both with the perception of Russia, but also with the perception of China. And obviously for countries that are in the accession process, that are not in the EU, for their political elites, there might be a temptation of, the lure of investment and subsidies coming from the EU, they come with the very strong strings attached. They are requiring very hard, politically unpopular reform often, and they are actually requiring a tremendous effort of domestic reforms and changing and improving their countries that might be disturbing the existing power balances in those countries. And they might be, at least in the short term, they might even come with painful costs. And then, these elites, it's not surprising if they are tempted to replace those financial flows with investments from countries where such strings are not attached. And those countries are actually, at least for the Southeast Europe, that's Russia and China, both of them. And the real cost to their countries may not be visible, neither to the elites, or they simply may not necessarily care of what will it actually mean. So the perception is very different. In many Eastern European countries, you would see at least a level of caution towards Russia, because at least there are parts of the intellectual elites who remember the influence of Russia before these countries joined the EU, and there is a level of worry. But at the same time, you also see very active disinformation measures, which are trying to win over the hearts and minds of people towards presenting Russia as some sort of a vanguard of traditional conservative values. And that is receptive in my home country of Slovakia, but elsewhere as well, definitely in Southeastern Europe as well. So you have a combination of, on one hand, the very skillful and geopolitically motivated economic statecraft. So what China and Russia is doing, it makes sense for those countries. Where the problem is that the European Union is allowing this to happen. And I think that that's partly explained by what maybe I hope I'm not caricaturing it too much, but it's sort of a market fundamentalism in the EU. So we have a market fundamentalism, or the regulatory state, which is being attacked by an economic statecraft. And EU needs to wake up and needs to start treating this is actually an attack. This is an attack on the values. So unless we change our approach and we start evaluating not only, as you rightly said, what is the market and looking at the at the market terminal, but looking at actually what is the implication on the democracy and the stability of these countries. My biggest worry, because in the midterm, we are going to get out of this unpleasant energy dependency with Russia. But my biggest worry is that there is a path that we need to walk to get out of this dependency. That path, you can call it energy transition. And my biggest worry is that this energy transition will be derailed. And I think that Russia is actively working to derail European Union's energy transition and trying to prolong our dependency on the fossil fuel that they are exporting. I don't see too much thinking in the EU of either speeding up the transition or figuring out a way to provide stability measures for those countries that are dependent. And the second thing that I would like to say, I would also be very concerned of replacing the dependency on Russian energy with dependency on Chinese technology in renewables. We see it a lot, mainly the one that is really coming out is obviously the telecoms. There has been quite a lot of discussion about 5G networks, but we also see that there is very high market share of Chinese technology in solar renewable, and the controllers and smart technology that is running our households increasingly in Europe. And I don't see too much discussion about what does it mean in the long term.
That's an absolutely important point. And let's not forget that also going forward and with the green transition, we may also depend on Chinese rare earths, right, for equipment. So are we swapping one kind of dependence of Russian dependence on Russian gas for dependence on Chinese raw materials for the energy transition? But before I go to Benjamin, I would like to ask Agnia about this inflection point that Benjamin mentioned, and the fact that we are now at the point where we have to think whether we keep the free market model or whether we, let's say, rethink it. Are we going, because clearly there is a risk, there is a geopolitical risk which does not match or our model, free market model does not match this system. So are we going to see a diluted free market model for Europe, do you think? Do you think that national security will have to prevail over ideological thinking?
I think the European Union and the United States is only now probably just starting to, if starting at all, to come to grips with the fact that this is, kind of a global competition or geostrategic competition between, democratic, rule-based societies and authoritarian states. And I think this conversation really highlighted some of the risks where, the market doesn't take care of everything, or our regulatory system doesn't take care of all the issues. And in fact, the European Union and the individual countries do have a great level of vulnerability and weakness in relation to actors that are pursuing, a 360 game in terms of their investment, the information warfare campaign that goes along with it, the exporting, political co-option, and so on. So I think this realization is only starting to happen, and I think for me, it's still unclear what steps, say, the European Union or the United States will take to start to counter it. And I think this perfect example was, if we look at Nord Stream 2 or the European gas markets, I mean, this perfectly exemplifies it. Because in my last book, The New Geopolitics of Gas, I wrote essentially how the natural gas markets have completely transformed. There's now a global market for gas. There's LNG. So important countries have so many more options, and they're there's so many more drivers coming from the market rather than actors like Gazprom. But that at the same time, we now see the current situation, this current winter, where Gazprom nonetheless was able to, have an impact on gas pricing, where projects like Nord Stream 2 were pushed through, even though in current market conditions, a project like that really doesn't make sense. And again, given the ultimate aims of the Germany, of the EU, to go towards renewables. So for me, this is kind of like the perfect example where markets and regulation is often not enough. So I don't know. I can't say I'm incredibly optimistic for the near term that we will come to grips with all of this and have effective ways to counter countries like China or Russia.
Clearly a big dilemma ahead for all of us. Benjamin, I wanted to ask you about the support that the US could offer for European countries, particularly with regards to countering cyber risk. And because we haven't mentioned it yet, but it's so much, it's so much on the agenda. Last night, even that there was a spate of cyber attacks against Ukrainian government websites, and also, as I mentioned earlier, the oil depots in Germany. But the US has a lot of expertise in that regard. How could it help, and what sort of other projects, and not necessarily on cyber attacks, but also the 3 Cs initiative, for example, is one project that is being driven by the US in support of Eastern Europe. But what else could be done to support Europe as a whole?
Those are great questions. I think in terms of cyber, we've had energy diversification policies for many years in Europe, and as Agnia and others have said, the Eastern European focus on this through things like the 3 Cs initiative have gotten us to a point where there is more resiliency. But you can have the most resilient, diversified energy mix, whether it's renewables based or hydrocarbons based or nuclear based. If you have a cyber attack, you can turn those pieces of energy infrastructure into statues, and they don't do anything for you if there's a cyber or physical security attack. So that's why that has to be part of the European Union's approach to NATO's approach. I think NATO has taken steps on getting energy security into its thinking, because when we're looking at these threats from authoritarian nations, we're often looking at them in terms of what are known as gray zone challenges or hybrid threats or things like this. These sub-military intervention thresholds that put significant pressure on our democratic resilience, on our ability to have free and open decisions on certain policies in certain countries. And that's why we need to look at this in terms of sovereignty, in terms of self-determination. We're seeing this discussion go on right now, and let there be no doubt, with the current military buildup around Ukraine's border, only Ukraine can choose. The people of a free and democratic Ukraine can choose their political alliances. They can choose their defense alliances. They can choose their political structure and self-determination. But very similarly, with respect to energy and other sort of gray zone threats, when you see headlines, as I mentioned earlier, that Russia is trying to pressure Moldova into not taking market steps, not taking regulatory steps to better integrate with the EU, that's a piece of political pressure, right? That is undermining the ability of a country to determine its own political trajectory, and that's really important. And we also have to look at this in terms of influence. This is obviously something that I've spoken about before. I just wrote an article in Foreign Policy magazine that came out last night with Casey Michel, calling for more transatlantic legislative synchronization on stopping former senior officials from sitting on the boards of authoritarian state-owned enterprises or their proxies. We've called for things like that former officials would have to give up any sort of pension or benefits that they got if they were sitting on one of these firms. We've called for legislative approaches and just a joint statement to begin with that this is not good, and that on a transatlantic level there has to be a new norm set that this sort of influence can't happen, because that undermines confidence in Western leaders' current abilities to push back on Russia and China. If there's this hint of thought in the minds of the electorate that maybe they're making these decisions also because they're seeing this Schroederized model in the future. That's why we called for potentially a U.S. bill called the Stop Helping America's Malign Enemies Act, or SHAME Act. So these are the sort of things that we need to think about. We also have to think about it in the United States. Remember, Politico reported that just last month, for the fourth quarter of 2021, the number 5 largest single lobbying contract in Washington was Nord Stream 2 AG. And the number 8 was Huawei Industries or Huawei Technologies USA. And both of those have those companies have ties to their parent companies in authoritarian nations, being Nord Stream 2 AG being 100% owned and operated by Kremlin-controlled Gazprom, and Huawei Technologies USA being having Huawei China as its parent company. So these sort of investments in infrastructure and things like this, we need to really look at how do we get norms so that influence can be checked from authoritarian nations over democratic societies.
Thank you. And before we wrap up, I'd like to ask Emily a final question. Clearly, you're a Russia expert, but looking forward, what, in your view, is the bigger risk, Russian or Chinese influence in the European or indeed Western energy sector?
I think that's a great question. I think it probably it's a little bit more complicated to answer than I would like it to be. In the short and medium term, I would say certainly Russia. You cannot deny just the volume of dependency that Europe has on Russian natural gas. That said, as Agnia said in her book, which was fantastic and pointed out, there is a little bit more of a global market for gas now. And this obviously has tremendous benefits, as we've seen, right? The ability to come in with, more LNG during the time of a crisis. But there's also a sort of downside of that for the Europeans, which is that they are no longer the only game in town when it comes to, being a consumer of gas, right? Asia is a consumer of gas. That's part of the reason why prices have been so sky high, is that, all of this sort of excess and spare capacity gas, LNG and spot market gas, there are different places that it can go. It's not just Europe, right? So as Asia becomes an increasing competitor for these sort of extra supplies, that will also pose additional challenges to Europe's, security of supply and energy. Now, if you're asking me in general, which is sort of the greatest threat in terms of everything, not just energy, I think certainly that China is a serious threat, as we've discussed, sort of just in terms of the battle between a rules-based liberal order and illiberalism, which is sort of undergirding this entire conversation. Because, what's different now, say, than even 20 years ago, is that liberal democracy is no longer the only game in town. It's very clear that there is an alternative model out there, one that is espoused by both China and Russia. And we see this in Europe now, right? There's many illiberal leaders and illiberal regimes within Europe right now that, buy this model or purport to buy this model. And so upholding the liberal rules-based order when this is a challenge narrative is harder, right? And it's harder now when you have states like China and Russia, pursuing this illiberalism undergirded by power independence that we see in the energy sector. So it's the energy conversation, I think, as we've really discussed in this entire panel, is no longer just about energy anymore. It's about sort of really large fundamental ideas about what we believe the transatlantic consensus should be, how unified we are on that message, and how best to sort of both pad and sustain that liberal internationalism, or whether this will crumble in the face of individual states' interests and individual leaders and regimes, whether they are more inclined to praise Vladimir Putin and his illiberalism, or are more dependent on Russian gas and just want to pursue that security as opposed to espousing liberal democracy. And I think that the German case is actually quite an interesting example of this, as we've discussed a lot today. I spent a lot of time in Berlin. I worked for the German Institute of Economic Relations. And, we see how, and this is very clear now, we see how German utilities companies are such powerful lobbies in German politics. They are connected with German industry, which is part of the lifeblood of the European economy. And they are all very friendly with Gazprom because Gazprom has had a kind of stable and profitable relationship, and Gazprom has lobbied them a lot. And so we see just this reluctance over and over of the Germans to come out and say, we're going to cancel this project because of very serious German domestic political concerns. So I think that is a very complicated question. And unfortunately, I don't think there's any easy answers for us.
And we've also run out of time. And thank you very much, everyone, for this really interesting debate. I think, Emily, you've summed it up really well. Going forward, it's a question of whether we batten down the hatches to protect ourselves, or whether we allow ourselves to be carried away by the attraction of more money, Chinese, Russian money coming in. But this is for an altogether other debate, hopefully soon. Thank you very much, everyone, and stay safe wherever you are. Take care.